Does anyone recognize this guy here?
No.
No.
Anyone heard of him before? Hands up if you have.
No.
So
Yeah.
actually, that's quite a testament to his life, because he did so much in India, but he always wanted to make a renown and make Jesus' name known, not his own name.
Yeah.
And 200 years later, even though he did incredible missionary work, nobody's ever heard of him. But they have heard of Jesus. And the church in India today is thriving, is growing. The evangelical church is independent. It doesn't have to rely on Western Christians. And partly that's due to this man who helped Jesus become known there. So the first thing I think we can take from his life is that he was selfless and gave all the glory to Christ.
Yeah.
So he was born in Prussia, which is now in this place is in Poland. And he eventually was ordained in 1749, came to India in the 1750s, and died in India in 1798. And one commentator said that he was the greatest of all the 18th century missionaries to India. And through his life, more was done to plant this evangelical church than anyone else. And perhaps that's to do with our upbringing, as Liz will share on the next slide.
Christian Friedrich Schwartz was born to Maria Schwartz, and sadly her first husband and 3 children died. So Christian Friedrich was son of her second husband. She'd had a daughter and desperately wanted a son. And she prayed to God in the same way Hannah did, asking that he give her a son, and that if God answered that prayer, she would dedicate the boy to God and to Christ. Sadly, Maria died before Frederick was 5, and on her deathbed, she made her husband, who was a baker, and the pastor solemnly vowed before the Lord that Christian Friedrich would be nurtured and trained for the service of God. At age 8, in order to fulfill that promise that had been made to his mother, he was sent away to grammar school, and he came under the influence of a teaching of a local pastor. So the fulfilling of her wishes started at a very young age, and that training to go towards ministry and to come to know God and to know and be able to share the gospel started when he was 8 and when he went to this grammar school.
He had some really good role models, because that part of Germany and Northern Europe was very much the heart of Lutheranism, and he was really inspired by August Frank, who was a missionary and scholar who believed that everyone should have an education. So he set up missions around the world where everyone, male or female, rich or poor, was given basic literacy, and they learned from Christian texts, and they learned about science and scientific thinking, and were given really a basic foundation of education along with the Christian faith. So he attended Halle University, and he was given bed and board in one of the orphanages that Frank had developed, because Frank believed in giving homes to orphans. And it's actually the same place where George Muller went to university about 150 years later. And George Muller was also inspired by these orphanages. And of course, he went to set up orphanages in Bristol and looked after thousands of children here in England. But both Schwartz and Muller were inspired by this gentleman, Frank. So he didn't just become a scholar overnight. He had to work hard, and he learnt Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and modern languages. He worked hard, and again, a lesson for our lives. We can't just expect to succeed by serendipity. We do need to continue training our minds and focusing on the goal that we have set for ourselves, that we want God to achieve. So he caught the eye of Benjamin Schwartz, who was a veteran missionary and just returned from 2 decades in India. Now, Schwartz was asked to assist in translating the Bible into Tamil, which he did. The Bible had already been translated in some parts into Tamil, but needed a bit more work. There are certain concepts when it comes to translating the Bible that it's difficult to do. For example, in one language, there was no phrase for forgiveness, because if you forgave someone, it was seen as losing face in that culture. If you didn't forgive someone, basically that would have been a kind of insult to your own status. And the only way that missionaries could translate that phrase was to not demand payback. So the concept of forgiveness is something that you have to teach other cultures.
Yeah.
Has that not worked? So Schwartz was ordained in Copenhagen on September 17th, 1749 by the Bishop of the Danish Church, along with several others. His ordination was arranged prior to him going out on mission trip. That was the purpose, was to kind of ordain him and bless him to go forward and do the work that he felt he'd been called to do. He travelled to India via London, where he became acquainted with George Whitefield, sorry, the spellbinding evangelical preacher of the day. And at the same time, whilst he was in London, he was called to preach in several places, including St James's Palace. It was around Christmas time, so there were lots of opportunities for him to kind of practice his preaching and share the gospel in what was probably a far more welcoming environment than what he would later experience in India. The voyage from Denmark across, no, Poland, sorry, wrong place, across to India took 5 months. It wasn't the easiest of crossings. I think he probably experienced a crossing very similar to Paul when he was on his mission trips. And the map here shows you where he was travelling to in India. So Tranquebar, this place at the bottom here, was a Danish trading port, and this was where Schwartz landed in 1750 to commence his missionary work.
So there were already Danish missionaries in this part of India, and they had set themselves up, but they faced huge opposition. There were many merchants who were worried that spreading the gospel would kind of limit their profits. So they threw these missionaries into prison.
Sure.
And I want to ask you the question, when you face storms of life like Schwartz did on his boat coming to India, or if you're thrown into prison like these missionaries, do you say, actually, this can't be God's will, I shouldn't be doing this, it's a sign that I'm in the wrong place? Or do you say, actually, I know what I've been called to do, I'm going to keep going despite the fact that the world is falling apart around me?
Yeah.
Clearly Schwartz didn't give up, because he had a vision and he knew what God had called him to. And these missionaries, they managed to translate the scripture and other scientific texts into the local languages. They set up printing presses and they were able to distribute it and help people. There's a bit of a culture clash between Christianity and the traditional Hindu beliefs, because they have God as creator, sustainer, destroyer. And God is part of the universe, which can never be destroyed. It can only be reborn. And in the same way, they believe in karma. And God is part of the universe, and the universe is full of karma, which means evil. So God has parts of him which are evil in the Hindu context. Whereas the Christian understanding is that God is not part of the universe. The universe didn't exist. God created the universe out of nothing, and he is distinctly separate from it. So that is a really unique belief of Christianity, that God is separate. There's no evil in him at all. And when we believe in him, he helps us from heaven. So pietism is the kind of theology that they believed in, which was that every true Christian is able to point to a time in their life when they've had an inner struggle with sin, which culminates in a crisis and ultimately a decision to start a new Christ-centered life. They were spreading confessional faith in India, evangelical faith, not Catholicism, but this personal relationship with Jesus. They really were into their teaching styles, because in Halle, it was all about education and learning the best way to teach people. And so they had all these modern techniques of learning things, and they set up schools wherever they went. Now, they trained local pastors, local disciples as pastor teachers. I can't pronounce that word, but I think it's something like catechists. And they very much, and Schwartz also in his life, he's always recruiting local people to assist in the mission work, local Tamil people. And they were the ones that went out and spread the gospel to the villages around. And more on that later. This will throw Liz, because I just put this in this morning, this slide. These are areas that you can see. So one of them is Gambadi. That is the Tranquil Bar port. That's another name for the Tranquil Bar. And then further down, you see it's a huge region we're dealing with here. Tanjore is somewhere in there. And then this place, Tiruchipalali, that's inland. That's where Schwartz was stationed later in his mission life. He was working as a chaplain, which is to show you the sort of scale of the regions he was working in.
Okay, so Schwartz started teaching at the existing schools that had already been set up by the Danish missionaries that were already in India. And he sought to set up new schools. So where new congregations were introduced and started to grow, he would introduce schools there as well. And I think the philosophy was very much not just about sharing the gospel and bringing people to know Jesus, but it was about educating them in a broad education of science and maths, and helping them to understand Christianity within the context so that they can come to know for themselves that relationship with Jesus, and not just as a kind of factual belief and kind of teaching of stories. It very much looking to develop that personal relationship. And he was incredibly good at this because he was a gifted schoolmaster, and he was able to communicate and share with a wide breadth of people because he was so proficient in language. When he was in university, he learned German and English and Greek, but he also learnt the local languages of Tamil and Telugu and Sanskrit and Marathias. So all of those more local languages he came to know so that he could share the gospel with the people in their own language. And the map there is another map showing kind of the area that he was covering. So this is, you can see there, we did that on Google Maps, and it's a 5.5 hour journey in today's world. So you can imagine how long those journeys would have been. But as we'll see later, Schwartz made the best of those opportunities when he was traveling as part of his mission work, to just be blessed by God to be able to use those travels and those opportunities that he came across.
So when he was a young man dreaming of being a missionary in India, he may not have been aware, well, he wouldn't have been aware that when he got there, it was going to be a massive civil war going on. Well, a huge war, really. It was all about the East India Company, the British with their native soldiers, the sepoy, fighting against the power-hungry, land-hungry French colonial troops. And that war was to go on for a long time. So what do we do when we have our dreams and they're shattered by the reality of life? Do we go, oh, this is not what I asked for? Or do we roll our sleeves up and plunge ourselves in and get involved?
Yeah, good.
So once Schwartz was traveling down to one of his congregations when a local Major A. Preston, requested his assistance because a powder magazine had blown up, and he describes in his journal the graphic details, the absolute suffering of hundreds of innocent people, because lots of soldiers died when this blew up. So rather than say, sorry, I'm busy, I'm a missionary, I've got work to do, he said, okay, I'll help. And he comforted the dying, he prayed with the sick, and he became a bit of a military chaplain for them. Now, in return, Major A. Preston promised that he would build a prayer hall for the Tamil Christians. So he was true to his word, and that was one of many buildings that were set up.
Now, in this time when Schwartz took on the role of chaplain, there is a account of one of the soldiers who went out and witnessed a funeral pyre. Now, in the Hindu religion, there was a young lady who had been married to an older gentleman, and in the Hindu religion, the young lady was to be burnt alongside her husband who had died on the funeral pyre. Now, the soldier saw this and intervened to say, I can't let that happen, and he took the young lady under his care. He came to Schwartz and said, I want to marry this young lady. Now, Schwartz was a very honest man. He was very upright, and so he kind of took his time and said, no, for a start, this lady is a Hindu, and you're a Christian, so I'm not willing to do that. But at the same time, he did a little bit of research, and he discovered that this particular soldier had a wife and children back in England.
Oh.
So again, he refused. He advised the soldier as to why he wasn't going to marry him in front of this young lady, and she was most upset and told the gentleman to go away from her. When he was then on his deathbed, he called for her to come back to him, which she did. And by this point, she had been learning about the Christian faith. And had made a decision to come to Christ. So once the gentleman had passed away, she inherited from him. He chose to give his inheritance to her. She came to Christ and came again to Schwartz and asked to be baptized, which he did. By that point, he felt that she had come to know Jesus for herself. And out of that were... The lady is called Clorinda, and out of that, a church was built, which is a church that is still thriving today.
So I wanted to draw the link between the kind of lifestyle that Schwartz had and also the biblical pattern of being interrupted when you're doing things for God. Because we know that Jesus, when he was going about healing the sick and preaching, he would often be called on people and he'd have to stop and go and help them. But he didn't just say, sorry, I'm too busy. For example, Jairus' daughter, he went to the house and prayed for her. And then we have blind Bartimaeus shouting out to Jesus. And the 10 lepers, they had to call out to him, and he went out of his way to help them. In the same way, Paul, when he was traveling, he had the man from Macedonia appear to him in a dream and saying, come and help us. So he diverted his plans and went. And I think it's important that we're willing to go and help people when we're serving God. We can't just say, no, this is my plan. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to put blinkers on and ignore the people around me who are suffering.
When Schwartz first went over to India as a missionary, he went over under the Dutch Missionary Society. In his links with the East India Company and his role as chaplain, this changed later in his life. And he was actually officially appointed chaplain with a salary. That salary he actually used mainly to fund his missionary work. In addition, he was appointed missionary for the Society of Promoting Christian Knowledge. And this is kind of where he continued his work in India. He took a lot of the funds he was given through his work as a chaplain or anything else he was asked to do. A lot of that money and a lot of those funds went towards building schools. Because of the war, because of the fighting, there was a lot of orphans, there were a lot of children of both Tamil and English soldiers who he built the schools for, and they had that solid education that he felt was what was needed to support those children in both having a good future, but also in being able to come to know Christ in a full understanding.
So Christian never really wanted to get involved with political matters. He didn't want to join the side of the British. It just kind of happened as a result of him being embroiled in that war situation. But he was also asked to be an emissary. There was a modern day kind of Saddam Hussein in Mysore who was called Hyder Ali, and he was about to attack the British troops. But he asked Christian Friedrich Schwartz to come and be a peacemaker. So he was the one that had to go on a secret peace mission. And he went on an 8-week journey to get up to Mysore. And everything on the way, everywhere he went, he spread the gospel. He used it as a chance to sow seeds. They traveled through a war zone, but they were completely unarmed. And they did not have any kind of military escort. They basically just went by entrusting themselves to God. And that reminds me of this verse, which I'm going to read to you from the book of 1 Peter. So talking about Jesus, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So Schwartz's security and his defense was not in any kind of weapons. It was actually just by being an honest person, and he showed no deceit at all. He became so trustworthy that he was used when there were relief efforts, when there were besieged towns and there was a massive shortage of food. He went in and organized aid for those people and the buying of food, and his word alone was enough to guarantee debts. He could underwrite debts just by his word, because he was so trusted around that part of India.
The peace mission that he was asked to do, he was chosen because of his honesty and integrity, and also because of his knowledge of languages. He could go and take the message and have that negotiations without needing an interpreter, without needing a third party. And that was something that was recognized as being a strength for him, is the fact that he had that honesty and integrity. He was going as a missionary. He had no agenda for himself. He was very much there to fulfill God's work.
And interestingly, when you read his journals and diary entries about this. He was negotiating with this despot dictator and also with the British, but he said the despot dictator's far more honest and he's a lot more straightforward in his agenda, whereas the British were all a bit tricky, doing all kinds of secret maneuverings, and they were very power hungry. So now we'll look at how he was a father to orphans. Move this slide up a bit so you can see it.
They can see it. They can't see it.
I don't know. Whoops. Move that out of the way. There.
It's yours.
Okay, like Samuel, who was adopted by Eli, Schwartz was put into the hands of God, honouring his mother's wishes. And as I said, Frank, who'd set up these orphanages in Halle in Germany, had inspired him. So he set up many orphanages, and he became a father figure to the dying, to the new Maharaja. On his deathbed, the Maharaja, who had the whole kingdom of around Tanjore, basically said, look, I'm dying. I want you to make sure my successor, who was not his son, but it was his young cousin, I want to make sure he rules in my place and that he's able to be brought up and well educated. But of course, when this young boy was then inherited his relation, I can't say uncle, he inherited the Maharaja's throne, and all these advisors and people came and locked him up when they held him under house arrest. A bit like in medieval times when there's a young king, they often get manipulated. And Schwartz knew this was not according to the Maharaja's wishes, so he appealed to the authorities in various other parts of India, and they overruled this. And eventually he lived with Schwartz, and Schwartz raised him as his own son. He taught him about the Christian faith and about lots of Christian texts. He also raised him with a scientific understanding. And when he became the Maharaja, he built a wonderful room of wonders inside his palace. And this actually had microscopes. It had one of the best libraries in the modern world at the time. It had all kinds of scientific journals. And this young prince became a founding member of the British Geographical Society. So he's incredibly well educated. Yeah.
So from the mission work of Schwartz, there are things today in India that can still be seen, and the influences that are there within the Christian church in India. So in 1790, I'm not going to try and pronounce that name, but he was the first Tamil missionary of the Lutheran Church in India. So he had been under the guidance of Schwartz, and he became the first native Tamil missionary within the community in India. Reginald Herbert, who was Bishop of Calcutta, estimated the number of Tamils who came to faith directly because of Schwartz at 6,000. Now, if that's the number that are directly because of Schwartz, how many more are there because of those that Schwartz had taught and brought to faith themselves? So the influence of his mission work is exponential. He was also responsible for the education of Vedinanjam, who became one of the greatest Tamil poets and hymn composers. And the dynasty of Vedinanjam is still evident today. Henry and I looked for something that we could share with you from the Christian Tamil people. And there is a lot of Tamil Christian music. Obviously, it is in their language. It's lovely to listen to, but what it means, we have no idea. So we decided not to show you any of it, but it's a testimony of the influence that is come from Schwartz's work in India. And he very much wanted to train the local people in Christian faith and in sharing that Christian faith along in their own community. And he made a lot of work of sharing, using his own funds, where he was paid as a chaplain, or where he was did the peace mission work, where he went as an envoy. He was paid for that, but he didn't want to, he didn't accept that payment. He used that to put it straight back into his own missionary work. And he was very much looking to train the local people.
One of the guys that grew up in the court of this prince, who was also adopted by Schwartz, actually became one of the greatest Tamil Christian writers. And he wrote a Tamil version of Pilgrim's Progress. So rather than being set in the kind of Northern European setting with the swamp of despond and the mire and the sort of giants that we encountered that are part of like a European fairy tale, folk tale, he set it in the kind of Tamil tradition, and it was a really long saga. And apparently it's a really good piece of work. There are also loads of poems and hymns, and there's a completely different kind of hymnology that they have in their church compared to what we have, which is really great that it's all come out of that. Okay, so why do we choose Christian Friedrich Schwartz? Well, I'll just read you a few words about some of the effigies to him. One of the Brahmins of the Hindu religion, when he was speaking, he solemnly declared to Schwartz, "You are a holy man. If all your Christians thought, spoke, and lived as you do, we would, without delay, undergo the change and become Christians." So he was such a genuine person, and that people were inspired by him. When Schwartz suffered his final illness, he called the Sefoy, that's the young prince, to his side, and he bestowed a special blessing on him. He exhorted the prince to rule all his subjects with even-handed justice, to protect his Tamil Christian subjects from persecution, and to submit himself to the grace and mercy of the one and true God, who alone could give him eternal peace. If we go back to the slide of that image of Schwartz blessing the young prince there, you can see him on his deathbed. There's three other orphans sort of huddled around the deathbed. Now, there's a legend in my family that one of my great-great-grandfathers was one of those children. So he may have been brought up in that court. We don't know. We do know that actually one of the clerks in the court, part of the bureaucracy, he was a Malaiperuman, and he changed his name to David when he became a Christian. And so we know that certainly there was this connection with our family. So that's one of the reasons for studying him. Yeah. So there you go. That's the life of Christian Friedrich Schwartz.